Welcome to another classic drama in the world's 100 Greatest Books collection by IntelliQuest. The play we'll discuss in this session is The Cherry Orchard by the famous Russian author of the last century, Anton Chekhov. The Cherry Orchard was Chekhov's last play, a comedy that borders on farce. It was first performed on January 17, 1904, Chekhov's 44th birthday. This was also his 25th year as a writer, and a great celebration was planned for The Cherry Orchard's premiere. Although he was only 44, Chekhov was a famous and productive writer. He was also close to death, and had been diagnosed with consumption a few years earlier. This opening night allowed his many admirers to warmly greet him with an ovation that Chekhov cherished until his death a little more than 6 months later. The Cherry Orchard was first directed by the famous Stanislavski, but his interpretation of the play was totally in contradiction to Chekhov's intentions. Chekhov wrote a comedy, but Stanislavski produced a tragic piece of social commentary. The critics didn't like the play, and Chekhov said of them, "First they turned me into a weeper, and then into a simply boring writer." Chekhov insisted that he hadn't written a drama, and when The Cherry Orchard opened in another city a few months later, it was much more successfully received. We can assume that the interpretation was changed. Since that time, The Cherry Orchard has remained Chekhov's most famous accomplishment. Before we review the play, let's look at the life of Anton Chekhov. Anton Chekhov described himself once to another author in this famous passage of how to write a good story. "Write a story of how a young man, the son of a serf, a former grocery boy, chorister, high school lad, and university student, who was brought up to respect rank, to kiss priests' hands, to revere other people's ideas, to give thanks for every morsel of bread, who was whipped many times, who without rubbers traipsed from pupil to pupil, who used his fists and tormented animals, who was fond of dining with rich relatives, who was hypocritical in his dealings with God and men gratuitously, out of the mere consciousness of his insignificance. Write how this youth squeezes the slave out of himself drop by drop, and how, waking up one fine morning, he feels that in his veins flows no longer the blood of a slave, but that of a real man." This gives us a clear idea of Chekhov's humor, varied background, talent with words, and indomitable spirit. He was born in 1860 and had 4 brothers and a sister. His father was a peasant who became a grocer and kept his children from being born into the Russian peasant class. For more information on the role of peasants and the Russian political climate of the late 1800s, you may want to review the Instant Expert Sessions on Tolstoy. Chekhov's father was harsh and ignorant. He beat his children and forced them to attend religious services, which he himself was very fond of. Chekhov learned early to suspect people who too much expressed religious fervor. In later life he wrote to his brother, "It is sickening and dreadful to recall the extent to which lying mutilated our childhood." His family lived in a depressed little seaport town, and Chekhov had to balance his schoolwork with working in his father's store. His father lost the store through mismanagement, and the family fled their creditors by moving to Moscow. Chekhov stayed behind, finishing school in poverty-stricken relief, finally freed for the time being from his family. But he rejoined them when he came to Moscow and entered medical school. He soon assumed the role of breadwinner through his fluent and easy talent for writing. He wrote all kinds of fillers and articles for newspapers, including ads, recipes, and jokes. He wrote short stories and essays, and even wrote news articles and features. He was able to produce a great deal of copy with few revisions. Most of this early work was light and humorous, although a touch of realism and idealism sometimes flavored his work. He felt no particular pride in writing, which was simply a way to earn money. Chekhov had special contempt for journalists, whom he called crooks, perhaps sarcastically. He jokingly suggested that their influence was wearing off on him, and that his friends noticed that from a distance he looked like a crook too. All this work paid his way through medical school, and he was a dedicated physician through much of his adult life. Doctors at that time, especially those who practiced in poor areas, were not made wealthy by their profession. Chekhov was forced to continue to write to support himself and his family. He enjoyed both professions and said, "Medicine is my lawful wife and literature is my mistress. Neither of them loses anything through my infidelity." Chekhov's experience as a doctor probably helped him to better understand people. He certainly could have few illusions about life as a physician who treated some very desperate patients. However, he was not especially cynical. In fact, you'll hear him make fun of cynicism in The Cherry Orchard and lampoon the melancholy Russian stereotype. By 1886, he had saved enough money to go to St. Petersburg, which was the literary center of Russia. By this time, he was well known. His work became more serious as he developed his craft. In 1887, he wrote his first play, a drama called Ivanov. The following year, he won a prestigious literary award called the Pushkin Prize. He almost felt unworthy of such a distinction, as his early works were written in haste and were rather lightweight. Although Chekhov contributed frequently to a liberal newspaper, he later wrote for publications with opposite politics. By his 30s, he realized that he held no fixed ideas about politics or religion, although for many years he admired Count Leo Tolstoy's philosophy. But Tolstoy's emphasis on spiritual principles contrasted, in Chekhov's mind, to the world of science and of culture and comforts. In his writings, as you'll hear, he doesn't moralize or give answers. He uses his art to illuminate the lives and feelings of people in a way he thought would entertain. If Chekhov can be said to have a philosophy, perhaps he expressed it in this quote from a letter he wrote. "My holy of holies is the human body, health, intelligence, talent, inspiration, love, and absolute freedom. Freedom from violence and falsehood, no matter how the last two manifest themselves." Although he didn't make a show of being a philanthropist, Chekhov took on a fascinating project in 1890 when he left everything behind to travel to a distant island near Japan, a Russian prison colony. This was an arduous trip and involved traveling by train, boat, and sled. He stayed for more than 3 months to personally study and write about the prisoners in this desolate place. The book that he wrote following the ordeal, which was probably intended to focus attention and compassion on the convicts, was a failure and on the surface achieved nothing. Chekhov, however, seemed pleased with his efforts. He bought an estate in the province of Moscow, and his family moved there. His delicate health was worsening, and he had a persistent cough, perhaps thinking to heal himself in a country setting that was beautiful and peaceful. He treated hundreds of peasants there free of charge, instead of resting and improving his health. This financial burden forced him to write more. He also made frequent trips to Moscow, where he had many friends. He was an energetic and adventurous person, and would have liked to travel to America, but a lack of funds and health prevented it. In 1897, he found out that he had consumption, or as we know it, tuberculosis, and was told to stop his medical practice and rest. Although he did go to France for the climate and a prolonged rest, he didn't stop writing or traveling. By 1898, his health had declined so much that he was forced to retire to the mild climate of Yalta on the Black Sea. This same year, one of Chekhov's plays, The Seagull, was revived in Moscow. The play had been a failure when it was first presented, but during its successful revival, he met a young actress named Olga Knipper. They corresponded for 3 years and married in 1901. Chekhov stayed in Yalta while Olga continued to perform in Moscow. By this time, Chekhov was one of the most famous authors in Russia. He frequently traveled to Moscow, and his work in the theater exhausted him. He died in 1904, the same year that he attended the premiere of The Cherry Orchard. Chekhov started The Cherry Orchard in 1902. It's a comedy in 4 acts and is set in the Russia of Chekhov's time. As we review the play and quote from it, bear in mind that Chekhov meant for us to see the humorous natures of the play's characters. The main characters in The Cherry Orchard are Madame Ranevskaya, a formerly wealthy landowner, Gaev, her middle-aged brother, Anya, her 17-year-old daughter, Varya, her adopted 22-year-old daughter, Pyotr, a student in his late 20s, Lopakhin, a newly prosperous merchant, and Fierce, an old, very old butler. All the action takes place on Madame Ranevskaya's estate. Act 1 begins in a room that's still called the nursery. It's May, just before dawn, and the cherry trees are in blossom, but the windows are shut against the morning frost. The maid enters, holding a candle. With her is Lopakhin, a well-dressed and prosperous merchant. They're happily awaiting the arrival from the train station of the estate's mistress, Madame Ranovskaya, who's been away for almost 6 years. Lopakhin recalls her kindness to him when he was a little boy. "When I was a boy of 15, my poor father, he had a shop here in the village then, punched me in the face with his fist and made my nose bleed. We'd come into the yard, I don't know what for, and he'd had a drop too much. Madame Ranovskaya, I remember her as if it were yesterday, led me to the wash basin in this very room, in the nursery. 'Don't cry, little peasant,' she said. 'It'll heal in time for your wedding.' A little peasant. My father was a peasant. It's true, and here I am in a white waistcoat and yellow shoes. A pig in a pastry shop, you might say." He remarks on the maid's appearance, too, which is more like that of a lady than of a maid, as are her affected manners. He says, "Look at the way you do your hair. That's not right. One should remember one's place." In this first scene, we see the dramatic device called exposition, where a character says something in the present action that tells us background for the story. This device is generally more subtle in today's best drama, where background is revealed through the natural conversation of characters, rather than as obvious remembrances of things past. You'll hear more obvious exposition later, when characters say things to each other that they should already know, in contrived exposition so that the audience is up to date. Also note that the characters tell us in the play what time it is, what room they're in, and what they're doing. In real life, you wouldn't, of course, do that with someone. Obvious exposition is a mark of an unsubtle play, and we might think here that Chekhov was being a little tongue-in-cheek throughout the play, when suddenly his characters launch into histories of their lives to give the audience the background they need to understand the story. Lopakhin's exposition in the opening of the play tells us that Madame Ranovskaya was kind to him, and that he and his family were peasants, although he's done quite well for himself. It's interesting that Lopakhin's father had a store, as Chekhov's did, and that his father beat him, again like Chekhov's. Perhaps Lopakhin resembles Chekhov in other ways, too. We also hear comic irony when Lopakhin, who comes from the peasant class, suggests to the maid that she remember her place in society and not dress like a lady. One last thing to note is how Lopakhin remembers this nursery where the first scene's action takes place. Listen for the other characters to tell their feelings about the nursery and about the cherry orchard. This is one of Chekhov's most consistent devices in the play, to show us who the characters are by revealing how they feel about a thing or a place. To return to Scene 1, the estate clerk enters carrying a bouquet to decorate the room. He drops it, then picks it up and hands it to the maid, saying, "There's a frost this morning, 3 degrees below, and yet the cherries are all in blossom." He complains that his newly purchased boots squeak, and that his life is filled with misfortune. He stumbles over a chair before making his exit, and after he's gone, the maid says, "He is crazy about me. He's an unlucky man. Every day something happens to him. They tease him about it. They call him 22 troubles." At the sound of carriages approaching, the maid gets flustered with excitement and says, "I'm going to faint this minute." The main characters enter. They are Madame Ranovskaya, her daughter Anya, her brother Gaev, and the governess. Madame Ranovskaya, Anya, and the governess have just arrived. Her brother Gaev met them at the station with the old butler Fierce. Madame Ranovskaya says, joyfully and through tears, "The nursery, my darling, lovely room. I slept here when I was a child, and here I am, like a child again." Madame Ranovskaya kisses her adopted daughter Varya, who's managed the estate since Madame Ranovskaya left. Madame Ranovskaya says, "Varya's just the same as ever, like a nun." The action proceeds with a bustle as the travelers greet their family, servants, and friends despite the hour. Anya looks toward her room and says, "My own room, my windows, just as though I'd never been away. Tomorrow morning I'll get up and run to the orchard." She tells the group of their recent time in Paris. "We got to Paris. It was cold there, snowing. Mama lived on the 5th floor. I went up there and found all kinds of Frenchmen, ladies, an old priest with a book. The place was full of tobacco smoke and so bleak. Suddenly I felt sorry for Mama. So sorry I took her head in my arms. Mama kept crying. She had already sold her villa. She had nothing left, nothing. I hadn't a kopeck left either. We had only just enough to get home. And Mama wouldn't understand. When we had a dinner at the stations, she always ordered the most expensive dishes and tipped the waiters a whole ruble. Anya says that the governess and the footman also ordered food without thought of its cost. We soon find out that Anya's father died 6 years ago, and a month after that her brother drowned here at the estate. Then Madame Ranovskaya left, unable to face the tragic past. We now know that Madame Ranovskaya is an emotional person whose children have to look after her. Her adopted daughter Varya runs the estate, and Anya provides emotional support and tries to curb her mother's spendthrift ways. Their return is a retreat from mounting debts. Everyone exits except Anya and Varya. When Anya asks her adopted sister Varya if the interest on the estate mortgage has been paid, Varya says there's no money and that the estate will have to be sold in August. At that moment, the merchant Lopakhin pops his head in, then disappears. Anya takes Varya in her arms and asks, "Varya, has he proposed to you?" Varya shakes her head, saying, "Oh, I don't think anything will ever come of it. He's too busy. If only we could marry you off to a rich man, I should feel at ease. Then I would go into a convent, and afterwards to Kiev, to Moscow. I would spend my life going from one holy place to another." Anya says, "The birds are singing in the orchard. What time is it?" Varya answers, "It must be after 2. Servants re-enter with coffee, and the very old and somewhat deaf butler, Fierce, fusses over it. He says to himself, "Home from Paris, and the old master used to go to Paris, too, by carriage." Madame Ranovskaya and her brother Gaev come back in. Gaev makes motions as if he were shooting pool. Madame Ranovskaya, seeing her brother's game, says, "Let's see, how does it go? Yellow ball in the corner, bank shot in the side pocket." Gaev says, "I'll tip it in the corner. There was a time, sister, when you and I used to sleep in this very room. And now I'm 51. They talk about the old days. The merchant Lopakhin enters as Madame Ranovskaya thanks Fierce for the coffee. She says to Fierce, "I'm so happy that you're still alive." Fierce responds, "A day before yesterday." And Gaev explains that the butler has gotten hard of hearing. Lopakhin expresses his thanks to Madame Ranovskaya for all her family did for his, recalling that his father and grandfather were serfs, while he's a prosperous merchant. But Madame Ranovskaya barely hears, as she continues to prattle about the room, fondly remembering the past. She goes to a table and kisses it at one point, and her brother Gaev sucks on a candy during the conversation. Lopakhin, the practical business person, directs the conversation to Madame Ranovskaya's financial problems. He says, "As you know, your cherry orchard is to be sold to pay your debts. The sale is to be on the 22nd of August. But don't you worry, my dear. Here is my plan." Madame Ranovskaya and Gaev barely pay attention as Lopakhin continues. "Your estate is only 15 miles from the town. The railway runs close by it, and if the cherry orchard and the land along the river bank were cut up into lots and these leased for summer cottages, you would have an income of at least 25,000 rubles a year." Neither Gaev nor Madame Ranovskaya seem impressed or even particularly interested in this scheme, especially when Lopakhin tells them that it would mean cutting down the orchard and tearing down their childhood home. Madame Ranovskaya says, "Cut down? My dear, forgive me, but you don't know what you're talking about. If there's one thing that's interesting, indeed remarkable, in the whole province, it's precisely our cherry orchard." Her brother points out that the orchard is even mentioned in the encyclopedia. The aged Fierce talks about the old days when the cherries were made into jam and sold for a profit. He and Madame Ranovskaya reminisce. Lopakhin can't keep Gaev or Madame Ranovskaya's attention. Varya comes in with telegrams from Paris for Madame Ranovskaya, who dramatically tears them up without reading them. Lopakhin finally leaves as Gaev plays his imaginary billiards, calling out his shots. Fierce reprimands Gaev for wearing the wrong trousers and says reprovingly, "What am I going to do with you?" Madame Ranovskaya looks out the window at the cherry orchard and says, all white. Oh, my orchard, after the dark, rainy autumn and the cold winter, you are young again and full of happiness. She wishes she could forget her past, but is reminded of it when her dead son's former tutor, Pyotr, enters. Madame Ranovskaya at first weeps at the reminder of her dead son, then asks the young tutor, "Tell me, Pyotr, why do you look so badly? Why have you aged so? Your hair's thin, and you're wearing glasses. Is it possible you're still a student?" Pyotr says that he supposes he's a perpetual student. It's another comic twist that this supposedly thoughtful woman could be so oblivious to this young man's feelings by commenting on his appearance as she did. After everyone leaves, Uncle Gaev tells his nieces, Anya and Varya, of some unlikely ways he plans to raise the money to save the estate. One of his plans is to borrow from a great-aunt. He munches on his candy and grandly reassures the young women. When Fierce re-enters, Gaev says, "Go away, Fierce. I'll undress myself." Then he gets carried away in speech-making about the past, and the old butler reprimands him and leads him to bed. When Varya and Anya are alone, Varya complains about the estate and the servants. Anya starts to fall asleep, so Varya leads her off to bed, leaving the tutor Pyotr on stage. He speaks toward Anya's sleepy form with saying, "My sunshine, my spring." The first act ends on this comic note of melodramatic love. In this first act, Chekhov shows some of the different Russian social classes. Gaev and Madame Ranovskaya, from the older aristocratic generation, talk about the past and ignore the present. The merchant Lopakhin has risen from peasant stock to relative fortune. He's a good-hearted, if uneducated, person. Pyotr is a student with liberal ideas. The maid and footman put on the airs of the high society they'd like to be a part of. The old retainer, Fierce, knows only the old ways and is literally deaf to learning anything new. The practical, adopted daughter, Varya, has borne the headaches of running the estate with almost no money and longs for the quiet of a convent. She'd prefer for Lopakhin to propose, but he's too busy accumulating wealth, and who can blame him after generations of family poverty? We've also heard the first references to the cherry orchard. The second act takes place in a meadow, as the governess, the footman, the maid, and the clerk, four of the play's more obviously comedic characters, sit on a bench near an old abandoned chapel. The governess wears an old hunting cap and has a gun on her shoulder. She's certainly not the traditional governess. The unfortunate and melancholy clerk, whose nickname is 22 Troubles, plays the guitar. The governess talks about her childhood, saying, "I don't know how old I am, and I always feel that I am very young. My father and mother used to go from fair to fair and give performances, and I used to do tricks. And when they died, a German lady adopted me. I became a governess, but where I come from and who I am, I don't know." Her story and manner are comical, but also a little sad. As the four talk, the maid is clearly infatuated with the footman, who traveled to Paris with the family. The clerk is engrossed in his sadness. He seems to be pining away for someone as he plays his guitar, and he says melodramatically, "I read all kinds of remarkable books, and yet I can never make out what direction I should take. Should I live, or should I shoot myself, properly speaking? Nevertheless, I always carry a revolver about me." He calmly shows it to the others, and we can only laugh at Chekhov's sarcasm here, which is directed at the melodramatic nature of stage plays in his time. Sensationalism, like the melancholy suitor who shoots himself, was rampant in the Russian stage at this time, and Chekhov is poking fun at it. This kind of wit fills the play. The governess calls the clerk a very clever man, and as she walks away she says, "These clever men are all so stupid. There's no one for me to talk to. Always alone, alone. I haven't a soul. And who I am and why I am, nobody knows." This little speech is humorous in satirizing the gloomy Russian nature, but it's also a glimpse of a person's loneliness. Once she's gone, we realize that the footman has seduced the maid, but the maid cares somewhat for the melancholy clerk, and the conceited footman cares only for himself. We also learn that the young daughter Anya has a love relationship with the tutor Pyotr as the act proceeds. While all this is going on, Lopakhin's still trying to get Madame Ranovskaya and her brother Gaev to consider leasing their land for summer cottages. He says, "Forgive me, but such frivolous people as you are, so queer and unbusinesslike, I never met in my life. One tells you in plain language that your estate is up for sale, and you don't seem to take it in." Madame Ranovskaya finds the idea of cottages and summer people too vulgar to discuss, and Gaev agrees as he shoots imaginary pool, crying out, "Bank shot in the corner." He also eats candies throughout the act. Madame Ranovskaya dramatically admits that she's no great financial success in this speech about her past, a speech that by today's dramatic standards would be considered hopelessly obvious exposition. She says, "Oh, my sins. I've squandered money away recklessly, like a lunatic, and I married a man who made nothing but debts. My husband was a terrific drinker. I fell in love with another man, and I lived with him. Then my little boy was drowned here in the river, and I went abroad forever, never to see this river again. But my lover followed me, pitiless, brutal. He fell ill, and for 3 years I knew no peace, no rest. The sick man wore me out. Last year, the villa was sold to pay my debts. I went to Paris, and there he robbed me, abandoned me, took up with another woman. I tried to poison myself. Then suddenly I felt drawn back to Russia, back to my own country." Madame Ranovskaya wipes her tears and pulls out a telegram from Paris saying, "He begs me to forgive him, implores me to go back," and she melodramatically tears it up. We hear the strains of a nearby band, and at the sound Madame Ranovskaya says that they should hire the band and have a party in the future. Gaev says that he's been offered a good job, but Madame Ranovskaya tells him he's not up to working. Fiers the butler comes in with Gaev's overcoat, and when Madame tells Fiers that he's aged, Fiers talks a bit about his long life as a servant. He says, "When freedom came for the serfs, I was already head footman. I wouldn't consent to be set free then." This is a joke in a way that Fiers didn't want his freedom because he'd achieved such a high slave status on the estate. Fiers remembers that everyone seemed happy then, but he can't remember why. Pyotr enters with Anya and Varya. Varya never leaves Pyotr and Anya alone. When Lopakhin teases Pyotr about always being a student, Pyotr tells Lopakhin that he's a rich man who will soon be a millionaire, like a beast of prey. Madame Ranovskaya steers the conversation to the topic they were on yesterday, pride. Pyotr says that people should stop admiring themselves. What do they have to be proud of? He says, "We should work, and that's all." He goes on melodramatically proclaiming the future of humanity in a speech that parallels Madame Ranovskaya's emotional outpourings. Pyotr says, "We must work, helping with all our might those who seek the truth. Here among us in Russia, only the very few work as yet. The great majority of the intelligentsia do nothing, are totally unfit for work of any kind. They are uncivil to their servants, treat the peasants like animals, are poor students, never read anything serious, and have little appreciation of the arts. The vast majority of us live like savages. They continue a bit more social commentary, and the sun sets. Gaev declaims solemnly, "O nature, wondrous nature, you shine with eternal radiance." As he goes on in this vein, his nieces ask him to stop, and Pyotr suggests that he should bank the yellow ball in the side pocket. Lopakhin again reminds them that the auction date is coming. Everyone exits but Anya and Pyotr, who are glad to finally be alone. Pyotr says that Varya is afraid they'll fall in love. Her narrow mind can't grasp that we're above love. To avoid the petty and illusory, everything that prevents us from being free and happy, that is the goal and meaning of our life. Anya enthusiastically proclaims, "What have you done to me, Pyotr? Why don't I love the cherry orchard as I used to?" He tells her that all Russia is their orchard, saying, "All your ancestors were serf owners, owners of living souls, and aren't human beings looking at you from every tree in the orchard, from every leaf? Your orchard is a fearful place. The cherry trees seem to be dreaming of things that happened 100, 200 years ago. To live in the present, we should first redeem our past by suffering, by extraordinary, unceasing labor." This speech has a little ironic farce in its passionate social overstatements, but it also has a haunting edge as Chekhov paints the cherry orchard's place in different characters' lives. To the aristocracy, it represents blossoming springtime, sweetness, and beauty. But in the trees themselves, the young liberal sees the ghosts of the slaves who worked the land. The cherry orchard is a symbol of oppression, which blossoms in continually mocking of a system that has yet to be destroyed. As the moon rises, we hear the mournful guitar of the clerk, 22 trebles. Act 2 ends in dramatic tension over lovers, philosophies, and financial problems. Will Madame Ranovskaya and Gaev take Lopakhin's warning seriously and lease the land? Can Madame Ranovskaya ever act responsibly? Which lovers will end up with which? We never see the actions that form the play's basic conflicts. They take place offstage. Chekhov creates tension through the everyday conversations of his characters instead of through onstage drama. They talk about music or old times or philosophy, but the undercurrent of their problems is a constant thread that involves us in the play. Act 3 is set inside the mansion in a drawing room. Madame Ranovskaya is having a dance. She rented the band she heard in Act 2, even though there's no money to pay for them. Instead of the nobility that used to come to balls at her mansion, the local post office clerk, the station master, and the servants join Madame Ranovskaya and their close friends for this festivity. The air is tense because this was the day of the auction, and everyone's waiting for Uncle Gaev to return, hopefully with the news that he bought the estate with money borrowed from the great-aunt. The governess does tricks, throwing her voice and making people disappear as an entertainment. Madame Ranovskaya keeps asking where her brother is, and everyone assures her that all must have gone well. The great-aunt had sent 15,000 rubles, but that isn't even enough to cover the interest on the mortgage. Madame Ranovskaya from time to time is overcome with tears and anxiety. The tension is made worse when Pyotr teases Varya about the merchant Lopakhin, who has still not proposed. Varya says, "He's absorbed in business. He has no time for me." She mentions her alternate plan of going into a convent and exits. Madame Ranovskaya tells Pyotr not to tease Varya, and Pyotr says that Varya is afraid he and Anya are falling in love. But he's from such vulgarity he's above love. Pyotr recommends that Madame Ranovskaya, who keeps wondering why her brother hasn't returned, calm herself. He says, "For once in your life you must face the truth." She says, "What truth? You settle every great problem so boldly, but tell me, my dear boy, isn't it because you're young? Because you don't yet know what one of your problems means in terms of suffering?" When the topic of Madame Ranovskaya's lover comes up, and Pyotr tries to tell her that she was robbed by the man, Madame Ranovskaya angrily tells Pyotr that his lack of falling in love has nothing to do with purity, as he'd like to believe. She says it's just prudishness. She calls Pyotr a comical freak, and he rushes out in anger, then falls down the stairs, which elicits great laughter from the guests off stage. Finally, Uncle Gaev arrives with the merchant Lopakhin. Gaev wipes his tears with one hand and holds a package of goodies in another. He asks the old butler Fierce to help him change and exits. Madame Ranovskaya asks if the cherry orchard was sold, and Lopakhin says that it was, that he bought it. She falls to a chair, and Varya throws her estate keys on the floor. Lopakhin is euphoric at owning the land where his father and grandfather were slaves. He laughs uproariously and says, "Now the cherry orchard's mine, mine! If my father and grandfather could rise from their graves and see all that has happened, how their Lopakhin, who used to be flogged, their half-literate Lopakhin, who used to run about barefoot in winter, how that very Lopakhin has bought the most magnificent estate in the world." He picks up the keys that Varya threw down and tells the band to play, saying, "Come, everybody, and see how Lopakhin will lay the axe to the cherry orchard. We will build summer cottages there, and our grandsons and great-grandsons will see a new life here." He sees his old friend Madame Ranovskaya weeping bitterly, and he asks her why she didn't listen to him and lease the land as he'd urged her to do for months. Anya comforts her mother, saying, "Don't cry. Life is still before you. You still have your kind, pure heart. Let us go away from here." And Act 3 ends. Lopakhin is no villain, because he tried to help the family keep their land. But his nature is to be businesslike and show a profit. In Act 4, we're back to the nursery where the play opened. Little furniture remains there, and the walls and windows are bare. Everyone comes and goes, packing to follow their different fates. Lopakhin has brought champagne to toast to their new beginnings, but no one drinks it except the conceited footman, who drinks it all. Just as the passage of months pushed the play to its climax, in this act each moment counts. Madame Ranovskaya has 20 minutes before she needs to go to the train station, which will take her back to Paris. She kept the 15,000 rubles from the rich great-aunt, and will no doubt spend it all quickly on the lover who has already proven his worthlessness. She's told that the ailing butler Fierce was taken to the hospital. Lopakhin's leaving too. He says, "I've been hanging round here with you till I'm worn out with loafing. I can't live without work. I don't know what to do with my hands. They dangle as if they didn't belong to me." He offers Pyotr some money for the university Pyotr's headed to, but the student refuses, saying, "If you were to offer me 200,000, I wouldn't take it. I'm a free man, and everything that all of you, rich and poor alike, value so highly and hold so dear hasn't the slightest power over me." We hear the sound of axes chopping trees in the background, and Anya asks Lopakhin to have the chopping halted until her mother can leave. The sound is too upsetting. The footman finishes preparing the luggage, happy to be going back to Paris. Even Madame Ranovskaya and Gaev seem cheerful. Gaev has a job, though no one thinks he'll keep it long, and Madame Ranovskaya has money, for the time being. Anya plans to finish school nearby and looks forward to lots and lots of reading. The comical governess does one last comic routine when she picks up a bundle and holds it like a baby, then throws it aside in mock indifference. Lopakhin promises to find her a new position. As the characters prepare to go, they refer to the time, and soon there are only 5 minutes left before they leave. Madame Ranovskaya suggests to Lopakhin that he propose to the long-suffering Varya. Everyone is out of the room for a few minutes, but when the two are alone, Lopakhin talks about the weather, and Varya distractedly looks for something in her luggage. The moment passes, and someone calls Lopakhin to come outside. Madame Ranovskaya and Gaev are the last to be in the nursery of their childhood, and they break into sobs. Finally, they all leave, and the stage is bare and silent. We hear an axe in the distance, then footsteps. Fierce appears in the doorway. He was forgotten. No one took him to the hospital, as they told Madame Ranovskaya they had. He sits on the sofa and says, "They've forgotten me." And his mind wanders to his old job. He wonders if Gaev has his coat on. He lies down and says, "There's no strength left in you, old fellow." Soon he's motionless. The last sound we hear is the axe felling the cherry orchard. This is a sudden heart-wrench from the almost slapstick comedy that preceded the play's end. Especially in the third act, the characters have been almost caricatures. In the last act, no one acknowledges any real tragedy. Madame Ranovskaya is going back to Paris, but she hasn't faced her spendthrift nature. Gaiev plays his invisible pool and chews candy. It's hard to imagine that he'll be a success in the business world. Anya and Pyotr have studying ahead, and look forward to that. But if their relationship has real potential for learning, or if their growth is anything deeper than Pyotr's proclamations, we haven't seen it. Varya remains disappointed. No proposal, just another job running someone else's house. But her future is similar to her past. She complained about both equally. Lopakhin will, obviously, continue to be industrious and wealthy. Even the footman is pleased with the turn of events. And that, of course, is the definition of comedy. A happy ending, where conflicts are resolved in a way that's agreeable to the main characters. Except for faithful old Fierce. Like Madame Ranovskaya and Gaiev, he's of the older generation, but, unlike them, he has no delusions about his fate. He's been left behind, and he knows it. They don't. Not yet.
This is the end of the session.